Welcome to the listening room, a quiet place for long-form thought, calm exploration, and deep understanding. Settle in and let's begin. We're going to talk about something that every human being knows intimately, even if they have never had words for it. We are going to talk about fear. Not fear as an emotion alone, and not fear as something dramatic or extreme, but fear as a process that begins quietly, automatically, and often invisibly inside the brain, long before we become consciously aware that anything is happening at all. Most people assume fear begins when they notice it, when their heart starts beating faster, when their stomach tightens, when their thoughts suddenly shift toward danger, worry, or caution. But what we will explore together is that fear begins earlier than that. It begins in the background of the mind. It begins in systems that evolved to protect us before language existed, before reasoning developed, and before we were capable of reflecting on our own experience. This episode is about understanding that hidden beginning. It is about how the brain identifies threat, assigns meaning to it, and prepares the body to respond before the conscious mind ever enters the conversation. When we say that the brain creates fear before you are aware of it, we are not speaking metaphorically. We are describing a biological and neurological sequence that operates faster than thought. This matters because so much of human behavior is shaped by reactions that feel voluntary but are actually initiated beneath awareness. Decisions, relationships, conflicts, avoidance, hesitation, defensiveness, and even patterns of overthinking are often downstream effects of fear that has already been generated by the brain before we have time to question it. Fear is not merely something that happens to us. It is something your brain constructs for us. It is a prediction, a preparation, a protective narrative formed from sensory input, memory, and survival logic. And because it happens so quickly, we tend to experience fear as if it is the truth itself, rather than as an interpretation created by our nervous system. In daily life, this shows up in subtle ways. A tone of voice that feels threatening, a situation that suddenly feels unsafe, a moment where your body reacts before your mind has had a chance to analyze, a sense of urgency without a clear cause. These are not malfunctions, they are signs that ancient systems are still operating inside a modern mind. Throughout history, fear has been our greatest protector and one of our most powerful influences. It shaped migration, social structures, warfare, cooperation, and survival. Entire civilizations were organized around perceived threats, whether from nature, other tribes, or the unknown. But on an individual level, fear still functions in exactly the same way it did tens of thousands of years ago. The difference is that the threats we face today are often abstract, symbolic, or psychological, rather than physical. So the central question becomes this: if fear is being generated before we are aware of it, how much control do we really have over our reactions? And what does it mean to understand fear not as something that happens suddenly, but as something that is built step by step inside the brain? This lecture is not about eliminating fear. It is about understanding it. Because understanding changes our relationship to experience. When you see how fear is created, it no longer feels like an enemy. It becomes a system you can observe, interpret, and gently guide. This is the foundation for everything that follows. Now let us move to the intellectual anchor of this episode. The thesis of this lecture is simple but profound. This episode will show that fear is not a reaction to reality itself, but a prediction created by the brain based on incomplete information, past experience, and evolutionary survival mechanisms, all of which operate before conscious awareness arises. In other words, fear is not something you choose, and it is not something that begins with your thoughts. It is something your brain constructs automatically in an attempt to protect you. Conscious awareness comes afterward, not before. By the end of this lecture, you will gain 3 things. First, understanding. You will see fear not as an emotional flaw, but as a neurological process with structure, logic, and history. Second, perspective. You will begin to recognize that many of your reactions are not personal failures or weaknesses, but the result of systems that evolved long before modern life existed. Third, insight. You will understand that awareness does not prevent fear from arising, but it changes how you interpret it and respond to it. And that shift alone has profound implications for how you live. This will be a calm exploration. We will rely on evidence-based reasoning, grounded neuroscience, and thoughtful reflection. There will be no urgency, no pressure to change, and no emotional manipulation. Only clarity. Now, we begin Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is about speed. It is about understanding how the brain processes information faster than consciousness can follow. Before we can understand fear, we must understand timing. When something happens in the world around you, your brain does not wait for your conscious mind to analyze it. The brain is always working ahead of awareness. Sensory information from your eyes, ears, skin, and body is constantly being collected, filtered, categorized, and evaluated. This happens in milliseconds. Your conscious experience is the final product, not the beginning of the process. Think of consciousness like a news report. By the time you hear the story, the event has already happened. In the same way, by the time you feel afraid, the brain has already detected something, labeled it as potentially significant, and prepared your body to respond. This is not because consciousness is weak. It is because consciousness is slow. Reflection, reasoning, and language require time. Survival does not wait. In early human history, delay meant death. A hesitation of even a fraction of a second could mean failing to escape a predator. So the brain evolved systems that operate independently of conscious thought. These systems do not ask permission, they act first and explain later. The fear response is one of these systems. When sensory information enters the brain, it is routed through multiple pathways simultaneously. One pathway is fast and imprecise. Another is slower and more detailed. The fast pathway asks a simple question: is this potentially dangerous? It does not seek certainty, it seeks speed. If the answer is possibly yes, fear is initiated. Your heart rate increases, your muscles receive more blood, your attention narrows, your body prepares for action. All of this happens before you have named what you are feeling. Only after these processes are underway does consciousness step in and say, "I feel afraid." So fear is not the result of conscious interpretation. Conscious interpretation is the result of fear already being generated. This explains why fear often feels sudden. It seems to come out of nowhere because it did not begin in your awareness. It began in neural circuits designed to protect you without consulting you. This also explains why logic often fails to stop fear. Logic arrives too late to prevent its creation. It can only influence what happens next. In this sense, fear is not irrational, it is pre-rational. It operates before reasoning exists in the process. Understanding this changes everything. It tells us that fear is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of intelligence operating at a level older than thought itself. The brain is constantly asking, what matters? What could harm us? What should we prepare for? And it does this quietly, automatically, and continuously. Most of the time, you never notice. The system works, adjusts, and releases. But when the brain detects something ambiguous, unfamiliar, or potentially harmful, it errs on the side of caution. It generates fear first and allows interpretation later. This is not a flaw. It is a design feature. And it is the foundation upon which the rest of this lecture will be built. In the next chapter, we will explore the specific structures inside the brain that make this possible. We will look at how ancient neural systems detect threat and why they are given priority over conscious thought. But before we move forward, let us gently close this chapter. What we have established is this. Fear does not begin with awareness. It begins with speed. It begins with survival systems that act before reflection. And by the time you feel afraid, the process is already well underway. You are not reacting too strongly. You are arriving late to a conversation your brain has already started. And now, we are ready to listen more closely to that conversation. Chapter 2: The Brain's Alarm System. Before we talk about fear as an experience, we must talk about fear as architecture. Fear is not an abstract feeling that floats through the mind. It is built into physical structures in the brain. These structures exist for one reason: to detect danger faster than conscious thought ever could. When you imagine the brain, you might picture something unified and centralized, like a command center. In reality, the brain is more like a layered system built over millions of years. Newer structures were added on top of older ones, but the older ones were never removed. They still run the most critical survival functions. Fear lives primarily in these ancient layers. At the center of this system is a small, almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. Its job is not to think, its job is to scan. It constantly evaluates incoming sensory information for emotional significance, especially threat. It does not care about nuance, context, or fairness. It cares about speed and survival. The amygdala receives information before your thinking brain does. In fact, it receives a simplified version of sensory input almost immediately after the senses detect something. This allows it to respond before the cortex has had time to analyze what is actually happening. This means that fear begins in a place that does not use language, logic, or reasoning. It begins in a place that operates on pattern recognition and biological urgency. The amygdala asks one question: does this resemble something that once meant danger? Not, is this actually dangerous? Not, what is the probability of harm? Only, have we seen something like this before that required protection? If the answer is even slightly yes, the alarm is triggered. This is why fear often feels disproportionate. The amygdala is not measuring reality, it is measuring resemblance to past threat. Once activated, the amygdala signals other parts of the brain and body. The hypothalamus is alerted. Stress hormones begin to release. The autonomic nervous system shifts into a state of readiness. Muscles tense. Attention narrows. Breathing changes. Your body begins preparing for action long before your mind understands why. This is not panic, this is preparation, and it happens in fractions of a second. Your thinking brain, primarily the prefrontal cortex, receives the same sensory information, but through a slower, more detailed pathway. This pathway allows for interpretation, comparison, memory access, and reasoning. But by the time it finishes its analysis, the body is already moving into a defensive posture. So you are living inside a dual system. One system asks, "Is this safe?" The other asks, "What is this really?" The problem is not that the systems exist. The problem is that the fast one always speaks first. This creates a fundamental imbalance in how we experience reality. We feel first. We understand second. We often assume the feeling is evidence. In truth, it is a hypothesis created by a protective system. Think about how many times you have felt uneasy without knowing why, or defensive without understanding the source, or anxious in situations that logically should be safe. This is not because you were mistaken. It is because your alarm system has detected a pattern that reminds it of danger, even if your rational mind sees no immediate threat. Your brain is not predicting reality. It is predicting risk. This system evolved in environments where mistakes were fatal. If a rustling in the bushes might be a predator, hesitation could mean death. So the brain learned to treat uncertainty itself as a form of danger. It became better to react unnecessarily than to fail to react when it truly mattered. Modern life has not removed this system. It has only changed the types of signals it receives. Today, the threats are rarely physical. They are social, emotional, symbolic, a tone of voice, a look, a memory, a situation that resembles past vulnerability. But the brain does not distinguish between physical and emotional danger at the level of survival circuitry. Threat is threat. This is why fear can arise in a quiet room, in a conversation, in a memory, in anticipation. The brain is responding to meaning, not just to events. The amygdala does not wait for proof, it acts on suggestion. And this explains something deeply important. Fear is not created by the present moment alone. It is created by the present moment filtered through the past. Every experience you have ever had becomes part of the brain's reference library. When something new appears, the brain asks, "Does this resemble anything that once hurt, shocked, threatened, or overwhelmed us?" If it does, even faintly, fear begins. This is why two people can experience the same situation and feel completely different. Their alarm systems are drawing from different histories. Fear is not about what is happening. Fear is about what this moment reminds your nervous system of. This makes fear deeply personal, but not consciously chosen. Now let's move deeper. The brain does not store memories as isolated facts. It stores emotional associations. When an experience carries strong emotion, especially fear, the amygdala strengthens the memory. It marks it as important. It tags it as something that should influence future decisions. This is how learning happens at the survival level. But this also means fear becomes self-reinforcing. Once the brain labels something as dangerous, it becomes more likely to detect danger in similar situations later. The system becomes more sensitive, not less. This is not pathology, it is adaptation. Your brain is trying to keep you alive in a world it doesn't fully understand. The problem is that this system doesn't easily update. It doesn't respond to reassurance, it responds to experience. It learns through exposure and safety, not through explanation. So when you tell yourself, "I shouldn't be afraid," you are speaking to the wrong part of the brain. The alarm system doesn't understand should, it understands pattern and consequence. And yet, awareness still matters.
not because it stops fear from starting, but because it changes how we relate to fear once it has begun. Understanding that fear is a signal, not a verdict, changes the emotional tone of experience. It turns fear from an authority into information. You are no longer asking, "Why am I like this?" You begin asking, "What is my brain trying to protect me from?" That question alone shifts the relationship from conflict to curiosity. Before we close this chapter, let's summarize gently. Fear is not born in thought, it is born in the brain's alarm system, an ancient network designed to act before awareness, before reasoning, and before certainty. It does not seek truth, it seeks safety. It does not wait for proof, it responds to resemblance. It does not ask permission, it acts first and informs later. You are not afraid because you are weak, you are afraid because your brain is doing what it was designed to do. In the next chapter, we will explore how the brain uses prediction rather than perception to shape fear. We will look at how the brain does not merely respond to reality, but actively constructs it in advance. And that's where fear becomes not just a reaction, but a story the brain tells itself about what might happen next.
Chapter 3: The Brain as a Prediction Machine. To understand how fear is created before awareness, we must now let go of a common assumption. We tend to believe that the brain passively receives the world, analyzes it, and then reacts. In reality, the brain does something far more interesting. It predicts first and perceives second. Your brain is not waiting to see what happens. It is constantly guessing what is about to happen. This is one of the most important ideas in modern neuroscience. The brain is a prediction machine. It builds models of the world based on past experience, and it uses those models to anticipate what comes next. Sensory input is not the starting point of perception. It is a correction mechanism. It updates the brain's predictions. So instead of asking, "What is happening?" the brain is asking, "Is what is happening matching what I expected?" Fear emerges when the prediction involves danger. Before your eyes finish seeing, before your ears finish hearing, before your conscious mind forms a thought, the brain has already projected a possible future. That future might include safety, neutrality, or threat. If threat is part of the prediction, fear begins. This means fear is not a reaction to reality, it is a reaction to a possible future imagined by the brain. And because this process happens outside of awareness, fear feels like a direct response to the present moment. But in truth, it is a response to what the brain thinks the present moment might become. Your brain is constantly running quiet simulations. What if this is dangerous? What if this leads to harm? What if we should prepare? You never hear these questions, you only feel their conclusions. This is why fear often feels anticipatory. It is about what might happen, not what is happening. Even when the threat seems immediate, fear is still a projection. The brain is preparing the body for an outcome that has not yet occurred. Fear is always future-oriented. Now consider what this means. If fear is based on prediction, then it is inherently uncertain. It is not a statement of fact, it is a hypothesis created by a nervous system designed to prioritize survival over accuracy. The brain would rather be wrong and safe than right and harmed. So it exaggerates risk, it fills in missing information, it completes incomplete patterns. It assumes danger when certainty is not available. This is not pessimism, it is biological strategy. When you walk into a dark room and feel uneasy, the brain is not reacting to what it sees, it is reacting to what it cannot see. It is predicting the possibility of threat in the absence of information. When you sense tension in a conversation, the brain is not reacting to words alone,
It is predicting possible outcomes based on tone, posture, memory, and past experience. Fear does not need evidence, it needs plausibility, and plausibility is enough to activate the alarm. This also explains why fear can persist even when logic says there is no danger. Logic addresses the present, fear addresses the future. They are speaking different languages. Your rational mind might say, nothing bad is happening. Your predictive brain says, but something could happen. And in survival terms, could is enough. Now we must look deeper into how the brain builds these predictions. The brain uses memory as its raw material. Every past experience becomes part of a reference library. The brain does not store events as neutral facts. It stores them as patterns of meaning and emotion, especially fear. When a memory is linked with danger or pain, it becomes weighted. It becomes influential. The brain marks it as important for future prediction. So when something similar appears in the present, the brain does not analyze it from scratch. It compares it to stored templates. This feels like that. That once led to harm. Prepare. Fear is born from resemblance, not from reality. This is why fear can arise in safe environments. The brain is not responding to the environment itself, it is responding to what the environment resembles. A sound that resembles a past threat, a facial expression that resembles rejection, a situation that resembles vulnerability. The brain does not distinguish between memory and perception at the level of emotion. If something feels familiar in a dangerous way, the alarm is activated. Now notice something important. If the brain predicts fear based on the past, then fear is always, in some sense, outdated. It is built from yesterday's information applied to today's situation. Sometimes this is accurate, sometimes it is not. But the brain does not know which in advance. It only knows that caution is safer than confidence. So fear is a conservative system. It resists change. It prefers what has worked before, even if the environment has evolved. This is why fear can feel stubborn. It is not designed to be flexible. It is designed to be protective. Understanding this transforms how we interpret fear. Fear is not intuition. Fear is prediction. Fear is not truth. Fear is probability estimation shaped by memory. Fear is not about now. Fear is about what the brain thinks might happen next. And because these predictions occur below awareness, fear feels authoritative. It feels like knowledge, but it is not knowledge. It is preparation. Now let us explore the human meaning of this. If fear is prediction, then awareness becomes a space where we can pause between the prediction and the response. Awareness does not stop the brain from predicting, but it gives us the ability to observe that prediction without immediately obeying it. You are not required to argue with fear. You are not required to eliminate it. You are only invited to recognize it as a forecast, not a command. That subtle shift changes everything. Instead of saying, something is wrong, you begin to say, my brain is predicting danger. Instead of saying, I must act, you begin to say, I can choose how to respond. This is not control, it is perspective. Before we close this chapter, let us summarize gently. Your brain is not a camera, it is a storyteller. It does not wait to see what happens, it imagines what might happen and prepares you for it. Fear is born in that imagination, a survival imagination, a protective imagination. Fear is the brain saying, based on what we know, caution is wise. It is not saying, this is the truth. It is saying, this is a possibility worth preparing for. In the next chapter, we will explore how the body becomes involved, how fear moves from prediction into physical sensation, how the nervous system turns a thought into a bodily state before the mind can fully understand what is happening. That is where fear becomes something you feel, not just something the brain predicts. And that is where the experience of fear becomes undeniable.
Chapter 4. When the body knows before the mind. Up to this point, we have spoken about fear as something that begins in the brain. But fear does not stay in the brain. It moves outward. It becomes physical. It becomes sensation. And often it is the body that alerts us to fear before the mind has any clear explanation for it. Many people say, "I felt it in my stomach," or "my chest tightened," or "my heart just dropped." These are not metaphors. They are descriptions of how fear first becomes conscious. The body receives the message before the mind has words. This is because fear is not designed to be thought about. It is designed to prepare the body to act. Once the brain's alarm system is triggered, signals are sent through the autonomic nervous system. This is the system that controls heart rate, breathing, digestion, muscle tension, and blood flow. It operates without conscious permission. It does not wait for reasoning. The sympathetic branch of this system becomes active. It shifts the body into readiness. Energy is redirected away from long-term processes like digestion and toward immediate survival. The heart pumps faster, breathing becomes quicker and shallower, muscles become primed, attention narrows. All of this can happen before you consciously think, "I am afraid." So fear is first experienced as a physical condition. Only later does it become an emotional label. This is why fear can feel so convincing. You are not just thinking it, you are inhabiting it. Your body is already aligned with the idea that something matters urgently. In this way, fear does not argue, it demonstrates. The body says, "We are preparing." The mind later says, "For what?" Now consider what this means. If fear first appears as a bodily state, then consciousness does not create fear, it interprets it. When you feel your heart racing or your chest tightening, your mind searches for an explanation. It tries to make sense of the sensation. This is where fear becomes personalized. The body reacts, the mind explains. And the explanation often depends on what is most available in memory: a recent stressor, a familiar worry, a story that fits the sensation. This means that sometimes fear does not come from the situation at all. Sometimes it comes from the body entering a state of alertness and the mind attaching a story to it afterward. The sensation arrives first, the meaning follows. This is a powerful and often misunderstood process. Your body does not know context. It knows activation. It knows readiness. It knows urgency. When those sensations appear, the mind assumes there must be a reason, and so it begins to search. This is not imagination, it is interpretation. Fear becomes the story we tell ourselves about why our body feels the way it does. This explains why fear can feel so real even when no immediate danger is present. The body is already convinced. The mind simply follows. Now, let us deepen this understanding. The body has its own form of memory. It remembers patterns of activation. If certain situations were once associated with threat, the body learns to react quickly when similar conditions appear again. This is often called implicit memory. It is memory without words. You may not remember a specific event, but your body remembers the state, a tone of voice, a posture, a silence, a feeling of unpredictability. The body recognizes these patterns and responds automatically. So fear is not just a mental prediction, it is a bodily memory being reactivated. This is why fear can feel immediate and unquestionable. The body is responding to something it believes it already knows. And once the body has shifted into a state of alert, it becomes harder for the mind to remain calm. The mind is influenced by the body's condition.
Thought follows physiology. This creates a loop. The brain predicts threat, the body prepares. The body's preparation reinforces the brain's prediction. The mind interprets the sensations as evidence, and fear becomes self-confirming. Not because it is true, but because it is embodied. This is a critical insight. Fear is not just an idea, it is a state of being, and states of being shape perception. When the body is calm, the world appears more neutral. When the body is tense, the world appears more threatening. So fear changes reality, not by altering the environment, but by altering the body that perceives it. This is not distortion, it is perspective shaped by physiology. Now we must speak gently about something important. The body's role in fear is not an error, it is the very mechanism that allowed humans to survive. Without rapid bodily activation, we would not have endured as a species. The body must move before the mind can analyze. But in modern life, this same system can become overly active, not because it is broken, but because the environment has changed. Now we face prolonged uncertainty, abstract threats, and emotional complexity rather than immediate physical danger. The body still reacts as if action is required, even when reflection would be more useful. So fear becomes prolonged. The body stays activated. The mind keeps searching for reasons, and the cycle continues. Understanding this allows us to approach fear differently, not as something to suppress, but as something to observe. Instead of asking, "What am I afraid of?" we can ask, "What state is my body in right now?" This shifts attention from story to sensation, from explanation to observation. And observation is the beginning of clarity. Now let us gently close this chapter. Fear becomes real when it enters the body. It becomes convincing when it alters sensation. It becomes personal when the mind explains those sensations. The body often knows before the mind, but the body does not know why. It only knows readiness. You are not afraid because you decided to be. You are afraid because your body was prepared before your mind had time to interpret. In the next chapter, we will explore how thought enters the process, how the mind builds narratives around fear, how interpretation, memory, and identity become involved. That is where fear becomes not only something you feel, but something you believe. Chapter 5. When fear becomes a story. Up to this point, we have watched fear form in layers. First, it begins as prediction in the brain. Then it becomes activation in the body. Now we arrive at the final transformation. Fear becomes a story. This is where fear stops being a physical state and becomes a meaning. It becomes something you think about yourself, about the world, and about what is likely to happen next. The mind does not like unexplained sensations. When the body shifts into alertness, the mind feels compelled to explain it. It asks, "Why do I feel this way?" And it does not wait patiently for evidence. It looks for the fastest explanation that fits. This is how fear becomes personalized. The brain predicts danger, the body prepares, the mind explains, and that explanation becomes your experience of fear. You do not just feel afraid. You feel afraid of something. That something is often constructed after the fear has already begun. The mind is a meaning-making machine. It is constantly building narratives to organize experience. When fear appears as bodily sensation, the mind assumes there must be a cause. It searches memory, context, and expectation to find a story that matches the state. Sometimes the story is accurate, sometimes it is not. But once the story is formed, it gives fear direction and identity. Instead of a vague tension, fear becomes, "This situation is dangerous. This person is a threat. I am not safe. I am about to fail. The story solidifies the emotion. And once fear becomes a story, it becomes something that feels true. Not because it has been verified, but because it explains what the body is experiencing. This is one of the most powerful mechanisms in human psychology. We trust our explanations because they give coherence to sensation. They make discomfort intelligible. But coherence is not the same as accuracy. The story is not created to be correct, it is created to make sense. Now consider how quickly this happens. You feel tension. Your mind supplies meaning. Within seconds, fear has an identity. At that point, fear is no longer just a state, it is now a belief about reality. This is where fear becomes durable. It can persist long after the original bodily activation has faded because the story continues to reinforce it. The mind replays the narrative. The narrative keeps the body alert. The loop continues. Fear becomes self-sustaining, not because danger is present, but because the story keeps the nervous system convinced that danger might be present. And this is how fear becomes part of identity. When the same stories repeat often enough, they stop feeling like temporary explanations and start feeling like truths about who you are and how the world works. I am someone who must be careful. The world is unpredictable. People cannot be trusted. I am not safe unless I stay alert. These are not conscious choices. They are long-term predictions that the brain has found useful. Fear becomes philosophy. Fear becomes worldview. This does not happen suddenly. It happens quietly, over time, through repetition. Each episode of fear strengthens the story. Each story strengthens the expectation. Each expectation primes the body for the next activation. So fear is no longer just an event, it becomes a lens. Now let us look at something subtle but important. The mind does not experience fear passively. It evaluates it, it judges it, it tries to control it, and in doing so, it often intensifies it. When fear appears, the mind tends to ask, is this bad? Should this be happening? How do I stop this? But these questions carry an assumption that fear is an error. When fear is treated as an error, the mind begins to struggle against it. That struggle adds tension. The body interprets that tension as further evidence of danger. The loop deepens. So fear becomes not just a reaction to a possible threat, but a reaction to itself. Fear fears fear. This is one of the most powerful amplifiers of distress, not the initial alarm, but the interpretation of the alarm as something wrong, dangerous, or unacceptable. If fear is seen as a message, it can be listened to. If fear is seen as a mistake, it must be fought. Creating creates more activation. Listening creates space. Now we must be very precise. Listening does not mean obeying. Listening means observing without assuming authority. Fear says something might matter. It does not say, this is certainly true. The story says, this means something is wrong. That is an interpretation, not a fact. So the human role is not to silence fear, but to understand the difference between sensation, prediction, and meaning. The sensation is the body. The prediction is the brain. The meaning is the mind. They are connected, but they are not the same. When we confuse them, fear feels absolute. When we separate them, fear becomes information. This separation is not emotional detachment, it is intellectual clarity. You are not your body's activation. You are not your brain's prediction. You are not your mind's story. You are the awareness that notices all three. That awareness does not remove fear, it changes your relationship to it. Before we close this chapter, let us summarize gently. Fear becomes powerful not when it begins, but when it is explained. The explanation gives fear direction. The direction gives fear identity. The identity gives fear authority. But fear does not arrive with truth attached. Truth is something the mind adds. The body prepares, the brain predicts, the mind interprets. Understanding this does not make you fearless, it makes you clear. In the final part, we will bring everything together. We will return to the thesis. We will look at how these systems interact as one unified process. And we will explore what it means to live with fear as a natural part of intelligence, rather than as something that defines you. We will end not with urgency and not with instruction, but with perspective. Because perspective is what transforms experience without forcing it to change.
Conclusion: seeing fear clearly. We began with a simple idea that fear does not begin in awareness. It begins before thought, before language, and before interpretation. It begins as a prediction inside the brain, shaped by survival, memory, and speed. It becomes a physical state inside the body, preparing for action, and only afterward does it become a story inside the mind, giving meaning to sensation and direction to experience. So let us return to the thesis in simpler language. Fear is not a reaction to reality itself. Fear is a preparation for what the brain thinks reality might become. It is a forecast, not a verdict. It is a possibility, not a certainty. It is a protective instinct, not a final truth. The brain predicts, the body prepares, the mind explains, and awareness arrives last, not first. When we understand this, fear changes its shape. It is no longer something mysterious or overwhelming. It becomes something intelligible, something structured, something that follows a pattern. In Chapter 1, we saw that fear begins with speed. The brain must act before consciousness can analyze. That is not a weakness, it is a design. Conscious thought is too slow for survival. Fear exists to fill that gap. In Chapter 2, we explored the alarm system, the ancient structures that scan for threat without language or logic. These systems do not care about fairness or accuracy. They care about survival. They respond to resemblance, not to proof. In Chapter 3, we learned that the brain predicts before it perceives. Fear is not a response to what is happening, but to what the brain thinks might happen. Fear is future-oriented. It is the nervous system preparing for possibility. In Chapter 4, we saw how fear becomes embodied. The body changes before the mind understands. Sensation arrives first. Interpretation follows. The body makes fear feel real because it is real, physiologically. And in Chapter 5, we saw how fear becomes a story. The mind gives meaning to sensation. That meaning gives fear identity, and identity gives fear authority. At no point did fear begin with choice. At no point did fear ask permission before acting. Fear begins as intelligence operating faster than awareness. This is perhaps the most important understanding of all. Fear is not the opposite of intelligence. Fear is intelligence, functioning at a deeper and older level than thought. It is the intelligence of survival, the intelligence of protection, the intelligence of continuity. When fear is misunderstood, it feels like an enemy. When fear is understood, it feels like a signal. A signal does not command, a signal informs, and information can be interpreted. This does not mean fear disappears. It means fear becomes part of a conversation rather than the final authority. You do not need to eliminate fear to live wisely. You only need to see what fear is and what it is not. Fear is not truth. Fear is not prophecy. Fear is not identity. Fear is a message from a system that was built to keep you alive in a world it cannot fully predict.
Once you see this, something subtle happens. Fear no longer feels personal in the same way. It no longer feels like a flaw in your character or a failure of your strength. It feels like a natural function of a complex organism trying to navigate uncertainty. You are not afraid because you are weak. You are afraid because your brain is always asking, what matters? What could go wrong? What should we prepare for? And it asks these questions even when you are calm, even when you are safe, even when nothing is happening. Fear is not an interruption of life. Fear is part of how life stays alive. But fear was never meant to rule. It was meant to inform. Awareness is what restores balance, not by stopping fear, but by placing it in context, by recognizing it as one voice among many, not the final judge of reality. When fear arises, you are not required to argue with it. You are not required to obey it. You are only invited to understand it. Understanding is not control, it is relationship, and relationship changes everything. When fear is seen clearly, it becomes quieter, not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer misunderstood. It no longer needs to shout to be heard. It no longer needs to dominate to be acknowledged. It becomes what it always was, a protective signal arising from a system that cares deeply about your survival. And now you can care for that system with clarity instead of conflict. Not rushing, not forcing, not correcting, simply seeing. This has been The Listening Room, a space for clarity, patience, and understanding. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you for listening.